Hello and welcome to another episode of Gender Stories. I know I always say that I'm excited, but what can I tell you? I have the best guests for this podcast. And so today I'm super excited to be welcoming Eli Lawliet, Ph.D., who is the dreamer and weaver of the Gender Doula. In addition to a decade of experience researching trans healthcare, law, policy, and history, Eli has formal training as a full spectrum doula, breathwork facilitator, and tarot reader, as well as many years of surviving the world of poverty, wages, and retail work. The broad scope of Eli's experience directly informs the equally broad spectrum of his work as a gender doula. He has been seeing clients since January of 2020 and has worked with hundreds of trans folks nationally and internationally in sessions, classes, and workshops. Though he was born in Oklahoma and raised in Missouri, Eli currently lives on Gabrieliño-Tongva, Chumash, and Kizh land, currently known as Los Angeles, with his partner, 3 cats, a dog, and 4 snakes. I'm so excited to welcome you, Eli, because I love your work. So welcome to Gender Stories.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Yes, and apologies to you and the listeners. I feel like my voice is all over the map at the moment. So this is what you get, dear listeners or watchers, if you're watching on YouTube. And I hope you can forgive me. This is what body minds do. They do their thing, and we just roll with it. So there's so many different things that I want to talk with you about. But why don't we just start from what is a gender doula for people who have never come across that term before?
So I like to describe gender doula work, or at least the work that I do as a gender doula, as full spectrum support for people who are questioning, exploring, or transitioning their gender. And then I also provide support for family members, allies, partners, and anyone really. Um, and what that support looks like is really tailored to the specific individual. That's why I say full spectrum, because one person might need a lot of help with understanding like how to even start questioning or exploring their gender, where to go from the questions of like, am I trans, or like, am I this label? How do you move forward from that? How do you know? Or another person might need a lot of support around starting hormones or seeking a surgeon, and someone else might need help like finding a new wardrobe and knowing how to buy pants in a type of sizing they've never experienced before.
Yes.
As many of us are familiar with that painful journey. So really this type of support I provide is very, very dependent on the needs of the person that I'm speaking
Mm,
to, which is also why I chose to call myself a doula, in part because doulas function in a sort of like medical adjacent capacity, often in the room with doctors and
mm.
as a part of the medical experience, but are not actually medical professionals. And so you have a lot of freedom and flexibility to function in ways that medical professionals couldn't. But also, you have a lot of like a large scope of different types of support that you can provide and ways that you can show up for people.
Absolutely. And actually, that was one of the questions I was going to ask for people who are listening and are thinking, oh, I always thought there was like therapists or counselors that supported kind of gender transition. Like, how is your work different? Right. And you've already said a little bit how you have a freedom that, of course, like a licensed therapist doesn't, I cannot go and shop with my clients, for example. And I don't know if that's something you do or could offer if somebody was local, or like, how do you feel that what you offer kind of differs from what maybe other healthcare providers can offer?
Yeah, so in terms of a therapist, I do think that there's many ways that the support that I offer often looks like therapy. So like for many of my clients, we're meeting for a set amount of time on a regular basis, right? Which is a rhythm that many of us associate with therapy, and we're spending a lot of that time talking often, right? So again, a rhythm many
Mhm.
of us associate with therapy. And so the way that I like to sort of draw this distinction, or the way that has made the most sense to me, is that I'm not here to offer modalities, right? In terms of like mental health modalities. So we're not going to be doing
Mm,
cognitive behavioral therapy or EMDR. We're
yes.
not going to be doing these things in the session. If you come to me with a problem, I can hold space for that problem. I can also give you practical advice. And I think advice is like a big part of it, right? But like if a client comes to me and they're like, I'm having a really hard time for example, getting started with my legal name change because I'm just overwhelmed and I'm stressed out and this is too much for me. I'm not going to come at that from a therapeutic direction of how do we necessarily like address the anxiety and the overwhelm. I'm going to come at it more from like, okay, how can I support you here? Like, would it be helpful if I made you a step by step list that you can follow? Would it be helpful if I talked you through your schedule and we figured out exactly when you can do each step? Obviously with a lot of gentleness and grace for if you can't actually do it on that day, right? Would it be helpful if I, this, right? So we're going to come at it from a more, I guess, like a more practical approach
Mhm.
and less of like a therapeutic approach. Of course, if I feel like they would benefit from therapy and that's something they're open to, I can also help them find a therapist who's affirming, right?
That's
But it's
great.
very
Mhm.
helpful that I do not have the same constraints that a therapist has on their practice.
Absolutely. And I think that also, I love that you talk about being a full spectrum doula, right? Because gender touches like on every aspect of our lives. I think we were saying that earlier, and like really there is no aspect of our lives that I think is not touched by gender. And so do you find that that's true in your work, right? That people really come for not just maybe what folks might think about transition traditionally, right? Name change, hormones, surgical interventions, if that's what people want, or even clothing or accessories or things like that. Like it's a really much kind of broader spectrum. And I'm assuming also changes across the lifetime, right? Like I've been out as trans for, I think it's 16 years now, and I'm still kind of like, oh, what am I wearing? And also like our bodies change as we age, and our needs change. And so, yes, like have you had that experience where clients really come for things that are really much beyond what we think about when we think about transition?
Absolutely. I have a very common experience with clients being like, "I know this isn't really about gender, but," and then they'll say, whatever it is, which I agree with you, everything is in some way about gender, right? But
Mhm.
it'll be like something about their job or their profession
Yes.
or, I've had a lot of clients over the years sort of organically shift into like spiritual support instead of gender support, which obviously there's a lot of crossover there. But
Mhm.
that's a thing that has happened, and to that end sometimes those things are very woven together, right? Like, we'll be doing gender support but I'm pulling tarot cards, right? And
Yes.
so that can happen. I have clients who see me for both tarot and gender doula, sometimes separately, sometimes together. I have clients who, I've gone through a whole journey with them over years of talking from like very
Mhm.
baby trans, like, do I even want to do this, to like now they're like fully launching into their lives and I'm supporting them in totally new ways, right? So
Mhm.
absolutely it definitely shifts and changes over. And then I will say I have a lot of clients who come to me who maybe transitioned 15, 20 years ago and now need to resolve the trauma of what it was like to transition 15, 20 years ago.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even 10 years ago, yes. I mean, I've started working as a therapist when it was still gender identity disorder. And that's what I had to be diagnosed with to be able to access my own kind of the transition services I wanted and what I had to diagnose clients with for them, and I often talked about, you're not disordered. This is just the portal that we have to walk through in the current system, right, to negotiate access and support for you to kind of live your life fully. And so that makes a lot of sense to me that folks will just want to really revisit kind of and in a way, the diagnosis was maybe the most benign part of that process. I also know a lot of horrific stories around having your gender judged by other people, not just professionals, right? And expectations of that people had of gender, and expectation that people had of our sexuality. I mean, even just 15 years ago, somebody was questioning me at the research conference. Well, if trans men really enjoy having, penetrative sex in their frontal, are they really trans? And I was like, yes. Like, especially as like a trans queer masculine person, I was like 100%. And also this conversation feels so unsafe right now to me on a personal level as well as on a professional level, even though I just presented on like there are many types of sexual identities that people have from my research, right? But it's just there's so much trauma in the field that people have experienced. And that is something that often we don't talk about, how some of the older trans folks have been really traumatized, how some of the responses sometimes that come through are really part of that trauma. And I'm really curious about what thoughts you're having as we're talking about this. I know for me, I'm like, oh my God, the floodgates are opening emotionally from all the memories, my own and my clients. But yes.
Yes, yeah. Well, I mean,
Mhm.
my 10 years on T is gonna be next March, so I'm like 9.5 years on T, and I spent my whole 20s in this sort of like horrible nightmare soup of gender exploration that was just like real rough. I mean, real rough, and that's part of why I do what I do now, right? But it was very flummoxing for me to tease apart sexuality and gender, because I couldn't really understand why I felt gay, but I had
Mhm.
always been sort of perceived myself as like a straight girl, because I was only ever attracted to men. And so that was actually a really confusing thing for me in like my 20s. Like, okay, I like identified as bi for a while, but I've literally never been attracted to a woman. And so I was like, okay, I'm only identifying as this because I know I feel queer, but I couldn't figure out like why I felt queer. And then, at some point it clicked for me. And I was able, and then I had to undo so many layers of like, I can't possibly call myself trans. Like, I'm just traumatized. I just wish I was cool. I just am delusional.
Mhm.
Like, all the many things. I mean, you name it, I had the imposter syndrome, like it was
Same.
really hard. So, yeah, like that sort of gender exploration during that time period was really, really rough. It was yeah, and I mean, things are rough now too in a completely different way, but it's
Mhm.
interesting to hold the challenges of folks who are transitioning now in the context of the backlash that we're experiencing, and then folks who are transitioning, 10, 15, 20, 25 years ago in the context of all the things that are relevant. I mean, I joke about how every cohort of trans people is like every 2 years. It's like every 2 years, it's a completely different experience to transition. And
Mhm.
so like as a person who's really studied a lot of trans history and who's lived a lot of trans history, I have like a pretty broad perspective of like what all those different cohorts sort of are like, at least in broad strokes. And that's very helpful for the different folks who come to see me.
Absolutely. Oh, I feel like this could be its own conversation, like all the historical trauma and bullshit that trans folks have had to go through because of, ubiquitous cisgenderism, and also because of just how the system was set up, right? And because of how the system was set up, it's really hard for a lot of us to like figure ourselves out. I even remember growing up going, I feel like I'm in drag, but it didn't make sense, right? Because I was presenting feminine and I was like, well, must well perform femininity if that's what's expected. And I always felt not very good at it. And like I was in drag, which now makes a lot of sense, right? And be much more like my community were really gay men more than lesbians. And then going, well, I guess I'm bisexual, but just attracted to masculine folks, regardless of their gender identity. And it was hard because there weren't as many role models or possibility models. I like that term better. But even with all the possibility models, now the increased visibility is its own challenge. So I'm with you. I feel like I love that every 2 years, right? It's kind of almost like its own cohort of challenges for trans people. And it is different and generationally, it can be very different. And also, if people come out now in their 60s compared to coming out in your 60s like 20 years ago, or come out in when they're 15 now compared to 20 years ago, right? It's so complex. Mhm.
Mhm.
And I think that complexity really highlights why it's important to have also like maybe a team approach. I don't know if you've also ever, like you talked about being a doula in a way, it's a really great way to being part of this kind of medical care team, and also for healthcare providers to understand what your role is, I'm assuming. And are you finding that you are collaborating with other healthcare professionals when you are working with clients, like, or are you finding the healthcare professionals maybe are not as invested or interested in connecting with you because it is seen as a more mainstream alternative. I don't know what adjective we want to use here, kind of approach to gender transition.
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't done much collaboration with healthcare professionals. I've done some collaboration, quite a lot more collaboration with therapists.
Mm.
I think that therapists really see it and really get it. And there's several therapists who were like quite close and professionally speaking and talk quite a lot and share resources and hopefully we'll be able to work together on doing like CEs and things like that to help
Mhm.
improve, which I do also train therapists. And I think
Yes.
ideally, I would also love to train healthcare professionals, but the sort of world of training healthcare professionals is specific.
Yes.
There's a lot of rules, there's a lot of gatekeeping, there's a lot of like specific language, and I think that maybe someday I'll have the resources and somebody on the other side of the equation will also be as interested as I am in that and want to collaborate in a meaningful way, but so far that hasn't materialized.
Yeah, that's real. I feel like medical doctors like to talk to other medical doctors and nurses to nurses and all that. And it's much harder, I think, to get into the medical world. And even if you do, it's just like it's a very different approach to what we're talking about. But I'm really glad that your clients have you on their side as they really explore all these different aspects of their gender journeys. And I use plural gender journeys on purpose. I feel like I've been on many gender journeys in my 50 plus years of life. And on that, I kind of want to go back to something you said about some of the clients really blur those boundaries between like, are they coming to you for tarot? Are they coming to you for gender doula services? Both, because I think spirituality, I don't know, it's been such a part of my journey. I know it's been a big part of the journey for a lot of other trans and binary and or gender expansive folks I've worked with. And so how are you finding kind of that integrating spirituality in people's kind of gender journey, or even transness as a spiritual experience in itself? In a way, a lot of us experience our gender identity as a almost like a spiritual identity, for want of a better word. At least I know I do. But
Yeah,
yeah.
I do as well. I was raised by conservative Christian family in the middle of the country, and I was quite young when I realized that that did not work for me. I was like, and I sort of floated around in the gray zone for many years, and then in my 20s, I was like, I'm an atheist, and I was like really hardcore about that.
Mhm.
And then when I was in my PhD program, many factors culminated. I had a very intense chronic illness crisis, and also grad school is just hell on earth, and
Oh my
like
God. Yes.
as you know, and I was
Yep.
like, I need a spiritual something, like I need something.
Yeah.
And so I thought about it and I was like, okay, like I can't, like organized religion is not for me. I was looking into some of the like sort of pagan options and I was like, first of all, most of these feel like organized religion. A lot of them are white supremacist and a lot of them are really like cis sexist. And I was like, I can't
Yes.
do that. So that all got checked to the side, and I was like, all right, what can and I didn't want to do cultural appropriation of anybody else's religion or
Yeah.
culture or spirituality. So I was like, what can I root into? Like, what is there here for me? And the only thing that felt solid enough to root into was transness. And so, really, starting at that point and ever since, I've been building a spirituality based on and in transness as a spiritual experience, but also as a lens that opens you up to what I have called sacred knowledge that
Mhm.
is only available through this process and this gauntlet of walking in the liminal space, right? And
Mhm.
being in that experience. And recently, my partner coined a term because I was reading about imaginal cells.
Mhm.
Yeah, which I'll explain for anybody who isn't
Yes.
aware. Imaginal cells are like cells that exist in caterpillars that hold all of the DNA information for how to turn into a butterfly. But when a caterpillar is in caterpillar mode, those cells are actually seen as invaders and are attacked by the immune system However, they're resilient, and a certain number of them survive. And when the caterpillar goes into its chrysalis and it turns into soup, those cells are the only things that sort of retain their function, and they tell the soup how to turn into a butterfly. And then that's how caterpillars become butterflies, right? And so reading through this, I was like, my brain is just like popping off. And I was
Yes.
like, oh my God. And so I went to my partner and I was like, trans people are the imaginal cells of humanity. Like this lines up so beautifully. And he was like, oh, it's like transimaginality. And I was like,
Yes.
that's the name of it. That's the name of my spirituality is transimaginality. So it's that very sort of like animistic orientation toward the world. And I use a lot of like animal and natural teachers as guides for understanding how I relate to the world and how transness is sort of this force that goes through all of nature and all of earth. And sorry, now I feel like I've gone completely on a tangent.
No,
But this is
no, this
just
is a
such an
great
important thing to
tangent.
me.
This is a great tangent. Keep going, Eli. I have no problem with this tangent.
Yeah, so I just feel like in terms of how spirituality shows up in my sessions with clients, right? I never want someone to feel like they have to believe what I believe. And actually, in fact, because of my allergy to organized religion, it's very important to me that my spirituality is actually a completely solitary and individual endeavor, right? Like there's much crossover with other people because animism is inherently like we are all of this earth.
Yes.
We can all observe this earth, right? So that's available to everyone at all times. But my very specific practices are my own, and I don't push them on anyone, and I wouldn't even tell anyone what they all are because it's personal.
Mhm.
So I do have clients that come to me and they're maybe more in a place where they either don't really vibe with spirituality or maybe it's just not a thing that resonates for them. And I'm not going to bring it into those spaces. But many people at this point are starting to know that this is who I am. And so a lot of people seek me out specifically because they want that interweaving. And so in that way, I will weave spirituality in. And like I mentioned before, for some of my clients, that's become the primary type of support that they're craving.
This makes so much sense to me because I feel now my brain is going in 500 different tangents, but it's okay. We'll figure it out. It makes so much sense to me because, often there is a spiritual existential aspect when we go on those gender journeys. And also, like, pretty much most cultures across the globe, including the culture where I come from, have like a sacred role for what we would call through an Anglo-Karen lens, trans non-binary gender expansive folks. So if I think about, the Southern Mediterranean in Italy and the Femminelli, where the keeper of the tradition of the Black Madonna, the specific Black Madonna, La Madonna di Montevergine, was like on the mound where people think there was a temple to Cybele, was the Frisian goddess, who had the priests called the Galli, where what we would probably call trans feminine people right now, but not exclusively, right? Almost everywhere in the globe has those ideas of like trans expansive, gender expansive, non-binary folks as connected to the divine in some way. And to me makes sense because of that liminality. We know witches are edge walkers, healers are edge walkers. And so of course, to me makes so much sense that a lot of us who are trans also feel this like hunger for spiritual connection, right? Because we feel it in our DNA, we feel it in our ancestry, we feel it in kind of the web of connection. And yet it's so difficult because so much of even whatever pagan religions that might have survived beyond some indigenous traditions are so heavily filtered through Christianity, right? Even like in paganism, sometimes I'm like, that is like kind of Protestantism light, and there's some like values that kind of questionable, right? And I'm like, we should think about this a little bit more. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but I was just so excited about this because I think that is something that a lot of people are yearning for, that what I would call like queer spirit and yet it's really hard to figure out, especially if people want to practice together, right? Because also, how do we practice together when we might come from many eclectic different traditions and different um, communities, because we don't have a place in our community of origin anymore. We're displaced sometimes through colonialism, through all the ways in which we've been displaced. Yeah. And and so for me, when I think about that, there's also an aspect of grief. And I know that I've worked with clients, especially Indigenous clients, on the grieving part of like, what would my life have looked like in a whole untouched by colonialism, right, community. And I don't know if you've come across that either in your own journey or with clients, but yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that I'm still untangling my own grief related to colonization because it's very complicated. On my dad's side is like very much Irish, and then my mom's side is sort of the classic white person blend of European, but like with a lot of Irish and British and other colonizers, right? And so like thinking through or like working with ancestors in terms of like, okay, what does it mean to hold blood of like colonizer and colonized?
Hmm.
Like I have recent ancestors who had to flee their home because of colonization and because of, genocide, right,
Hmm.
through the famine. And
Yeah.
then I also have recent ancestors who came to this land and stole land from native
Hmm.
people through various government programs, right?
Yeah.
And it's like that's a complicated thing to hold on to. And I think that this is where, because I'm a white person, and I think that all white people need to do very, very deep ancestor work and need to really like sit with these things and allow themselves to be in the pain and the discomfort and the grief of it, because how are I truly believe that it's white people's responsibility to deal with all the problems that our ancestors have caused and to dismantle white supremacy and whiteness as a whole, enterprise. And so how are we going to do that work if we're not first, tending to that grief and that pain in our ancestors and their the violence that they wrought upon so many different lands and so many different humans and so many different
Hmm.
animals, right? Like it's just the scope of it is so overwhelming that I think sometimes you need an entry point. And to me, the entry point is sort of like the ancestral, right?
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
also it's been very helpful for me to also relate to my ancestors and to
Yes.
use that as another point of like ancestral connection. I lead a ancestor sort of class, or it started as a workshop, became a class with another practitioner named Zell Amanzi, who's
Hmm.
incredible. And we offered that last May, and we'll probably offer it again next year, called Accessing Transcestral Wisdom. And that's been like such a generative space because, first of all, having a collaborator in that space where we can talk about our ancestral and transcestral practices, and they're so different, but there's so much crossover. And then bringing that to trans people and being like, look, you don't have to feel so alone. And
Yes.
like you can build community with your ancestors. And if humans are really hard for you, guess what? You have ancestors who are animals, who are plants, who are, different parts of the land, like this is all available to you, and we can teach you how to find your way in and like what works for you, right? And so just honestly, like first of all, having my own practice of transimaginality and
Hmm.
transcestor work, and then bringing that to a teaching space where I can be like, okay, this is what I figured out, and I'm joined by this incredible human who has so much wisdom to offer, and we can like hold cohorts through this. Oh my God, like nothing has been more healing to that part of me than that process.
Absolutely. I'm kind of actually like tearing up a little bit as you're talking about this, because I am seeing kind of a emergence of like people really connected to transcestors. I remember when my friend Dr. Pavini Moray started talking about gender blessed ancestors and transcestors. There were not that many people talking about those things, especially here in the US and amongst white people. And so it's really just so beautiful to see kind of this emergence of ancestral work. And I think it really speaks to our desire for collective liberation, right? I often say that, to dismantle white supremacy, we got to let go of whiteness and we got to know who we are. And I feel very lucky, to have belonging, to know what it feels like to be on land I belong to be brought up with ancestral practices, because I really see the disconnect and the damage of being disconnected from language, being disconnected from culture. It's been really interesting to get to know more trans Italian Americans and to just see the differences, where there is that yearning, but also the white supremacy, like that illness. I really think of white supremacy as a sickness, has taken such deep root that it's even hard to connect, even in a different way. And it's interesting, I think, for me, in the liminal space, right, of like having been brought up in this way but now being here and feeling like, what does it mean to help people connect with their ancestry, not in a commodifying way, not in a spiritual bypassing way, but in an authentic way where there can be that grieving, that can be that reconnecting, because it's just so countercultural to white supremacy, also to capitalism. When you were talking about animism, being brought up very much, I feel like Sicilian culture is very much an animist culture. And like all the time, like even in just small day-to-day things, right? Just the way we treat things in air quotes, right? Like just the care of like clothes and home, and homes having a name, and the tending of things. Again, like it's just very different, a very different feel. And I think there is so much hunger in the community. And so I was so excited when I saw that class, and I was like, oh, one day I'll have some spaciousness to add something else and take one of your classes, because I'm very excited about all of that. But I'm curious about, kind of, if you're finding also that during this time of yet another kind of anti-trans wave, this is also helping people build some, source of nourishment or a resourcing, or not maybe feeling so overwhelmed or alone. I know for me, when I feel like, oh, this is so heavy, I'm like, that connection to ancestors and to the larger ecosystem reminds me, this is not the first time. This is, that we're feeling this. There's so much wisdom in how we resist and transform, and I think that trans folks do. It's not an accident that often during the global rise of fascism in lots of different ways, trans folks are targeted. That's happened before, it's happening now, right? I'm saying a lot of words, but I think you know what I'm trying to get to. So you find in your work as well that people are finding this as a source of like joy, resilience, comfort, nourishment. I don't know, whatever words we might want to use.
Absolutely. Yeah, I made my 2024 sort of theme was resourcing.
Yes.
Yeah, and which I actually there's an astrologer named Diana Rose Harper who I adore. All of their work is incredible. Everybody should check them out. But Diana did a class called By Jove, which is a class all about Jupiter, and I took that class. I do a deep rest every January.
Mhm.
And so during my deep rest of 2023, I was taking that class, and in that class she talks about resourcing, and in this way that was so transformational to me, because I was like, oh, like I've been working with this concept but I didn't put it into that frame, and so that was like really fundamental to me thinking about how to move into 2024, because like you said, as we're seeing this rise of global fascism, as we're seeing this massive backlash, I have a lot of uh knowledge about trans history. A lot of my
Mhm.
PhD was trans history, and I've really studied so many different ways that these backlashes have come up. And so I have felt like that has been a protective, like, insulator around me, as a person who I think in many ways must hold hope no matter what for my
Yes.
community, right? And
Mhm.
so having the insulation of, right, but my ancestors have been through this, you
Yes.
know, and like seeing how they have managed these different waves, and knowing that backlashes are cyclical and that this is just one of like mini cycles of this, right? All of that has been so helpful to me. And then taking sort of these concepts of like resourcing and transistors and history and all that, and trying to like find ways to like give it back to the community. You know, like I did a whole class called Resource Your Trans Self, and that was very, you know, steeped in resourcing. But
Mhm.
honestly, everything that I do is because there's so many different ways to resource yourself. And I think that moving into the challenges of this year, knowing, hey, it's an election year, knowing things have been getting harder and harder for a while, and I don't know if we've
Mhm.
hit the crest of it yet, you know, I'm not sure. And so it really brings up this need that, like, hey, we've got to move differently, you
Yes.
know. And the little baby trans folks, like, they need people to be like, all right, baby, I got you, like, here's how you're gonna bolster
Yes.
yourself, you know. And the people who came out like in 2020, which is a lot of people who sort
Mhm.
of came out in a completely different context, and then got like tidal waves with all the hatred, you know, who are floundering now, a lot of them, right? It's like, okay, wait, deep breaths, we're gonna be okay, but we're going to have to learn how to move differently. We can't take for granted that we're safe. We can't take for granted that we have access to medical care. You know, we can't take for granted that we're not going to need to DIY our hormones. You
Oh
know,
yeah.
like we can't take these things for granted anymore. So, how do we resource ourselves? How do we root ourselves? How do we find ways to, like, even if it's just a teeny little bit? One thing that I use a lot in my classes is, does it make it even 1% better? Does it make it 2% better? Right? Like, we're looking to like add together these little things, and such that overall in a holistic way we're more resourced and more capable of meeting the moment, right? And
Mhm.
so I mean, I'm kind of also going off in a million directions, but I feel like this is sort of the most important thing to me, and the thing that undergirds everything that I'm offering, actually, certainly in this year, but also in general, is just like, how do we resource ourselves better? Because I want as many people as possible to survive this. You
Mhm.
know, I've lost people. I'm sure you've lost people.
Yeah.
I don't want to lose more. And
No.
I have seen the profound difference that resourcing has made in my life, but also in clients. You know, I've had clients who were like, "You're nuts. This is so ridiculous. Like,
I know.
I do not believe this is going to make a difference." And then 6 months later, they're like in a completely different place, you know?
God. So, so true. I resonate with so much of what you shared. And I think for me, what that really highlights also, it's like when we connect with the ecosystem, with ancestors, I think it also really highlights how important relationality is, right? Because a lot of people came out in 2020 because almost there was this isolation and this insulation, right, from the pervasive cisgenderism, gendered expectation. All of a sudden, people could maybe experiment a little bit more, but also they had a lot of time to be with their thoughts and their desires and inner worlds, right? And then this reality of the, if we look at those graphs where the anti-trans legislation like shoots up in 2021 and up to the present moment, right, in this current cycle of history. It's been a rough ride for a lot of people who came out then, because also like the insulation allowed them maybe to like, being in the soup, of that trans imaginality, but then also not having connection, not having community necessarily, right? And I don't know for you, but for me, community is such an important piece of it, right? And I know that sometimes people are like, but I'm more comfortable being community with like trees and green bloods and, or non-human animals rather than humans. And I'm like, yes, and we also need the humans. And at the moment, I'm really on this train of I feel like the queerest thing we can do is actually help people, especially white people, understand relationality and practice
Mm.
relationality, right? Because I feel like we have just part of the illness of white supremacy is that taking away of kinship, the really felt embodied sense of kinship, relationality. And I think for me, most of my nourishment is really through relationship, not just with humans, like, but relationship with ancestors, right? Relationship with spirit, relationship with the beautiful trees right outside my window, that I feel so fortunate and privileged to like steward. And so I'm wondering if you're coming across that push and pull sometimes with folks too, especially because as trans folks, we have been traumatized by people. So it makes sense that we don't want to be with other people. But I wonder if you find that resistance sometimes to people are like, maybe resistance not the it's not a good word I want to use, but like hesitance, right? Oh, I don't know about being with
Mm.
other trans folks or being in community. Does that make sense?
Definitely. I mean, I think that, as you mentioned, our community is comprised of people who are holding a lot of trauma in their bodies.
Yes.
And most of us have ruptured family systems, right? Because so
Yeah.
many of us lose some or all of our family when we come out,
Yeah.
And then even for those of us who don't lose our family, it's not always a good model. So there's like 1,000 different ways that we are sort of like um for lack of a better term, fucked when it comes to relationships,
Yes.
Like,
Yeah.
how are we supposed to build relationships that are sustainable and that will last and that are deep when we don't know how to be in relationship in ways that are healthy and that can withstand conflict and can withstand, all the things that are happening right now and the stress and the pressure, right? So you have this sort of perfect storm where we have this consistent narrative of like found family and
Mhm.
queer relationships and queer kinship and how beautiful that is. And it can be. And there's so much dysfunction and it's so hard, right? And so all of that is real. And I'm really into this idea of like weaving a basket big enough to hold the fullness of a thing, right? And so I think about like weaving a basket big enough to hold the complexity and the fullness of all of this and be like, yeah, all of it is true. You're not crazy if you feel like I can't possibly be in
Yes.
relationship with queer and trans people, right? You're not crazy. And also, we got to figure it out, y'all, because we're all we have, right?
Mhm.
And so when it comes to that, I do think that relationships with non-human and more than human beings can be a really good place to start, right? Like, I
Yeah.
think that that can be a place where you can heal. That can be a place where you can learn, right? Like this idea of
Mhm.
learning how to be in relationship, learning reciprocity, learning how to function as part of a web, right? Like that can definitely happen without another human. And also, I think that it is like humans have evolved to be in relationship with one another. And I think that there are needs that our bodies and that our spirits often have that remain unfulfilled if we have no other human relationships. But there's also practicalities, like you might need somebody to drive you home from the hospital after
Yeah.
surgery, you know? And so I think that, of course, there is a balance there. And I have nothing but empathy for people who are like, I cannot
Mhm.
be in relationship with other humans, right? Especially in this community where we're all holding so much trauma in our bodies. And also, I think that you can, a slightly different approach would be, okay, how do I how do I let my non-human and more than human relationships become the space where I heal, right? Like maybe you can develop a relationship with grandmother Hawthorne who both protects your heart and heals it simultaneously.
Mhm.
Like just these different ways that you can be in relationship with the earth and with whatever plants and whatever animals are resonant to you, but that can also, you can see this as, okay, maybe I need to take a step back, and also at some point I will need to take that step forward again when I'm ready, when I'm resourced. It's okay to need time, but I do think it's important to have relationships at least on some level with other humans when you can.
Absolutely. And that's why I was kind of hesitating. Like I was like, oh, resistance is not the right word because it's so pathologized, especially in mental health, right? It's like hesitancy feels better because and it makes sense. And yet, like we need to move into this web of like care and connection, which is also not easy because to be in relationship also means to risk hurting and being hurt. To there will be inevitable ruptures. Whenever I meet new clients, I'm always like, so we're going to have a rupture or a misattunement at the release at some point. How are we going to navigate that? Let's talk about what would I notice? How would you be able to communicate that or not? Right? Because let's face it, nobody's ever going to be completely attuned to another human. Rupture is going to happen. And then there is all this noise, right? From kind of this more Western white supremacist model of mental health. This is the right way of doing relationship. This is the wrong way. And I'm like, it's so much more complicated than that, right? These people over here are like irredeemable, because this is just who they are, like narcissist in air quotes, right? I have a lot of feelings about how things are framed in a way that's like irredeemable for some folks. I'm like, that's not helpful. It's all trauma in my books, and we need to heal, right? And I think that's why I'm so passionate about relationality, because I think that's how we heal. But it's also how we build community in a different way, right? It's like, how do we move away from this more carceral policing ways of relating to each other into more like true community of need rather than community of convenience? I love that differentiation I've learned from one of my beloved friends, Susan Rafa, was like, is this a community of need or a community of convenience? And I think a lot of us are used to communities of convenience where we can move in and out, and I think we actually need to learn how to be in a community of need more and more, as those things change. And I love that you offered learning not just one on one, but in a group setting, right? And like you do classes, because I guess that's also a way for people to practice, right? Dipping their toes into being in relationship with community, I'm imagining.
Absolutely. And that's
Mhm,
kinda it's funny that you mentioned that because, I love teaching. I'm a third generation teacher,
mhm,
and, I have formal teacher training, right? Like, I'm a PhD, and I've taught classes at, like, the university level, and all of that sort of informs how I show up as a teacher, and so I love it, and it really feeds me, and also I have been historically quite terrified of allowing my classes to exist outside of the classroom, right? In a way that's in relationship with one another. So I'll have like, here's the contact sheet if you want to get in touch. Like
yes.
y'all can do that yourselves, but people are like, oh, I want a community, I want a community. And I'm like, no, because I'm so scared of that. But it's been such a consistent ask. And so when we did accessing transcestral wisdom, there was a really strong desire for folks that wanted to stay in touch, and Sal and I chose that we were going to do a group chat. And it was obviously like you didn't have to opt in, but you could opt in, and then you
Mhm,
could be in that space. And we had very specific boundaries for the group chat, and it was fine. And I was like, okay. And so now I have a class upcoming, snake medicine, which is going to be starting in early September. And I've
mhm,
chosen for the first time ever to have like a group chat for that class, but I am moving toward like I'm doing the research process right now in terms of platforms, but I'm moving toward creating a actual community that people will be once they've taken snake medicine, then there will be like an alumni community. And it feels like a really scary step to me, but I agree with you.
mhm,
It's like we all have to push at our growth edges if we're gonna start changing the thing. And
mhm,
I've worked a lot around how to be in community, how to handle conflict and things like that. And I think at this point it's like, okay, like maybe I can trust my own self enough that I can create a container with adequate boundaries that things will be at least we understand how we move through conflict. We understand how we handle rupture. And so then
mhm.
hopefully things will be relatively cohesive. And that is a really scary and vulnerable thing for me personally to do. But I also think it's worth it.
I think so too. I think it's beautiful because, and if there aren't spaces, where we can practice the skills, right? Because not everybody's going to have like trans or queer or spiritual community available to them. And, as long as we have this beautiful magic of technology of the internet where we can connect, right? That's where we get to practice. How do we make agreements? And then how do we live by those values and agreements, especially when it's hard, right? And we're activated, which then brings in this essential piece of the somatic skills, right? The need to know our felt sense of relative safety, knowing our nervous system, knowing when we're activated and when we're going into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. I was like, wow, this is like my everyday like bread and butter, and I'm like tripping up on there. But I think because I'm so excited about this. And so I'm wondering also like how do you bring that into your classes and your work, that piece of like embodiment and nervous system? which can be so challenging for many of us trans folks, because many of us have survived through dissociating, which is also a gift because sometimes we've had to do that to survive. Sometimes we still have to do that to survive in certain environments. I know I definitely, as a trans disabled person, that's a very useful tool, and it's part of our human experience. And I also know that I need to be here in my body and present to connect and heal and be the integrated life I want to live. And so I'm wondering how you bring that embodiment piece into your work as well.
Yeah, in terms of classes and group settings, I think that it's really helpful to, well, there's quite a few tools that I use for this. One is sort of having like a grounding in moment, so doing some sort of, and then also giving a lot of space for people to do that differently, right? Like I'm gonna close my eyes, I'm gonna say some words. If you want to use this time to like move around the room or do a little dance or stretch or whatever, like love that. If you want to lay down, that's great, right? But just like giving people space to like do what their body needs to do, but also to like ground in and like, okay, we're coming into this container together, right? Another one, like very simple, but giving people a break in the middle
Yeah.
of the class, right? Like allowing for that break where people are like, okay, this class is halfway over. Now I'm going to get a chance to refill my water and go to the bathroom and look out the window and whatever, right?
Mhm.
That's very, very important. And I think also like giving an agenda, like, hey, this is the stuff that we're going to do today, has been a really helpful piece because then again, people know what their bodies need to be prepared for. And that's a really helpful piece. So those are in terms of like group settings, also having very clear expectations of for behavior and how things will
Mhm.
be handled if things go badly or if there's some sort of rupture, is a really helpful and important way of settling people's nervous systems. I also give a lot of space. So like you do not, if we're on Zoom, which all of my classes are, you don't have to be on camera. You don't have
Yeah.
to, interact. You can change your name and
Mhm.
be, totally anonymous, right? You can specify if you don't want me to read something from the chat, right? You can not show up in person at all and just watch the recording, right? Like there's
Mhm.
1,000 different ways that you can give people space to manage their own experience. And that's also an important piece is like having the agency to manage your own experience, right? I think that that's a
Absolutely.
huge part, honestly, a huge part of transition, right?
Yes, absolutely. I was going to say that's essential to transition, feeling that agency. Absolutely. Mhm.
Exactly. It's the most important thing. And then in one-on-one, I mean, the sky's the limit because when I'm working
Yeah.
one-on-one with someone, I can really respond in the moment, right? But one thing that I really enjoy doing is helping people get in touch with their bodies, in ways that feel accessible to them. And that's a highly personalized process because trans people tend to be very dissociated and we tend to hold a lot of trauma in our bodies. And so, we start so slowly, and I really try to impress on people that we're doing the smallest possible version. Like if it feels almost too easy to be worth doing, that's where we're starting,
Yeah,
like, and then we're
absolutely.
building
Mhm.
from that, right? And so that might look like, different somatic exercises, different breathing work, but ultimately it's a process of starting to build the bridge between your body and your sort of conscious brain.
Yeah, because that's a relationship too, and it's a relationship that often we haven't had the space, the privilege to like explore in the same way as cis folks, and it's a relationship that's also not encouraged by like white supremacist, capitalist, colonial culture, that it's like, oh, you have a cold, take this pill so you can get better faster and get back to producing, right? Just so that like now the CDC is like, oh, your children have lice. You don't have to send them home. That's okay, because otherwise parents miss out on work, right? And I'm just like, what is happening to us all that we cannot like rest and recover? Sometimes I do group consultations for organizations, and people are like, oh, I have COVID, but I'm here. I'm like, so you can be here if you want to, but I will take no offense if you want to like rest. And please, all the things you said, please get the camera, turn the camera off if you need to lie down while we're talking and listening, to each other. but we live in such a culture that just has such expectation of us not at being in deep relationship, because if we were in deep relationship with our embodied selves, I don't think we would be so ready to, to basically live the lives that we keep being pushed to live, right? Which requires some level of dissociation for all of us, I would say, in order to commodify ourselves in service to capitalism. Which, of course, to some degree, we all need to do, unless we're independently wealthy, which most of us trans folks are not. But you know, yeah, that's a lot. So talking about slowing down, I'm gonna take a breath, and I know it's so nice when we can just like take a moment to feel that spaciousness. I've started doing that even before I do speaking engagements, and really noticing the shift in the quality of the engagement over the past few years, since like introducing like a grounding practice, which is sometimes a little like alien in some environments, but it really helps. So when I slow down, I'm just feeling the richness of this conversation and the beauty of this conversation. And I feel like I could talk to you for another 4 hours, but actually, I'm going to be respectful of our body minds and not wear us down just in one conversation. But I am going to ask you to just take a moment, if you will, to just, you just mentioned that you have a class starting in September. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about the class, just in case people who are listening or watching are like, well, that sounds, I like what Eli's talking about. I want the medicine it's got to offer. Tell us more about this class.
Yeah, so the class that I'm offering, I offer it every fall. This will be my third year teaching it, and the class is called Snake Medicine. It is open to everyone, so it is absolutely for trans folks, but it's also for everybody. And this class is a class where we use the snake's shed cycle
Mhm.
as a roadmap for moving through personal transformation and also all the hard parts of life, right? Grief, loss, change, rage, joy, everything, right? This class, we basically, so let me back up a little bit. The way that I have come to this medicine is through my relationship with my snakes. I tend to two snakes. My partner also has two snakes, so there's four in the house. And my two snakes, we got actually all four of our snakes in the sort of height of the pandemic in 2020.
Mhm.
And it was like a very, it was that weird time where we were all
Yep,
finding new ways to be in the world. And one of our ways was by having snakes. And so
yep,
I had these little hatchling snakes and I was watching them go through, shed after shed after shed, because hatchlings shed quite a few times because they're
yep,
growing, right? And as this was going on, I was also working on a dissertation and I was also dealing with multiple chronic illnesses and we were also dealing with a pandemic and I was watching them shed and I was watching myself and I was like, "Oh, there's resonance here." Right? And I hadn't realized that shedding was a process that had sort of these like discrete sections or like phases. And when I started to put those things together, I started to really see the roadmap effect of it. Like, oh, if I can orient toward this experience as a process, I can know that I will not be in it forever, and
yes,
I can also develop a set of tools that when realize, like, oh, energetically, I'm here, I know what to do when I'm here, right?
yeah,
So at the time, I was in a doula mentorship and I brought it to my fellow doulas and I was like, I think I've got something here. And they were all just like, this is incredible. And I was like, cool, I'm going to sit on this for like 7 years and then I will teach it. But then it was actually the next year, I think in 2021, maybe, no, 20, it was in 2022. So it was in 2022 that I really had this strong message from my folks, is what I call it, like my
mhm,
spiritual
yeah,
everybody. So my folks were like, you need to teach snake medicine this year. And I was
yeah,
like, but this doesn't, like, all my content is about gender. Like, this isn't me. Nobody's gonna want this. And they were like, do it. And I was like, all right. So I did, and I'm so glad because it's such a rich, like, experience. And it's just been such a beautiful thing to like deepen into that material year after year. It's brought me so many beautiful relationships. And now it's my third year. And so it feels like this is more than ever such an important, like when we're talking about having different ways of moving or orienting
Yes.
toward the times we're in, snake medicine is exactly that. And I'm so relieved that I'm not teaching it for the first time this year, you know? So that's the class. It's 12 weeks because each module is so rich and has so much in it. So we have 6
Mhm.
modules, and that also includes, I didn't talk much about being a breathwork facilitator, but I am.
Mhm.
And so snake medicine also includes 4 group breathwork sessions. This year I'm adding new elements. I'm adding tarot spreads for each module. Each module has a workbook with journal questions and reflections and exercises. There's guided meditations. There's tarot sort of meditations, I guess, or like essays that I've written.
Mhm.
And there's also live group meetings where we talk through each phase. And I weave in some myth. We talk about Inanna's descent into the
Mhm.
underworld. So that's a part of it. And yeah, it's such a rich class. It's so beautiful. It's 12 weeks. It starts on September 9th and the signups end on September 6th. So if folks want to get signed up, they can go to my website. There's also a bit.ly link, so it's
Mhm.
bit.ly/snakemed, and the S and the M are capitalized. But you can
Thank
find it,
you.
I'm sure, in the show notes. Oh,
Oh, I will definitely put in the episode description all the links, and I'm so excited. I was smiling when you said. And then my folks were like, "You need to teach it this year," because I was like, "Oh yeah." I'm always arguing with mystery because it's like, well, you need to do this and this and this. And I'm like, that's great. So I need some cooperation here because some of me has so much capacity and I need you to help me prioritize, you know. So I was like, that makes sense to me that they were like, you cannot sit on this medicine for 7 years. This is what we need now. And like you said, I'm so glad you're not teaching it for the first time because the need is definitely, it sounds to me like it's initiatory medicine
yeah.
too, right? Because in a
Yeah.
way, it is a transformation. And so it makes sense using the Inanna story, with all the shedding at every gate, and the letting go. And we go through, I don't know, in my experience in my life, I feel like I've gone through so many initiations. Sure, some of them formal, so to speak, but most of them informal. And I often say when I work with initiates, it's like, I don't believe that like when we choose initiation, bad things happen to us. I believe that life initiates us all the time. And sometimes we recognize it and we look for the support and mentors and teachers that we need. But that because sometimes there is almost that kind of Christian fear, like, well, if I choose initiation, then difficult things will happen. I'm like, no, difficult things happen all the time in my experience
Yeah.
in our lives, right? At the very least on the collective level, even let alone on the individual level, right? And then if we're lucky, we get that support, that medicine that we need. So thank you for offering that beautiful medicine to
Yeah.
community. And it sounds like whether folks are like trans or cis or any gender identity, right, can access this, just to be
Yeah,
clear.
it's
Mm-hmm.
one of my offerings that is actually open to everyone. If folks want a closed space, I do group breathwork monthly on the third Tuesday called Breathwork for Trans Liberation, and that is closed to trans and gender expansive people. So
Mm-hmm.
that's, and honestly, every other thing I've offered this year has been closed. So this is a rare opportunity if you are not trans identified to be in one of my spaces, but it is a space that centers like
Mm-hmm.
transimaginality, as I explained
Yeah.
earlier. And
Mm-hmm.
it's always been that way. And honestly, every year it's just been so beautiful.
It sounds amazing. I know I was like, when I saw it, I was like, oh, I'm going through so many transitions that I want to take this class, but also it's a really busy fall. But who knows? Maybe Spirit will be like, take the class this year, even though I'm planning to take it this year. We'll see. I'm giving myself some spaciousness to think about it. Because even hearing you talk about it, I was like, yes, 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 to all of that, right? And I remember even being little in Sicily and finding snake skins, right, as they were shedding, and always being so fascinated. And I almost didn't want to touch them. It was
Hmm.
like I felt like such a sense of reverence, and I would just like sit with it and imagine. like the transformation and what it would feel. And now it makes so much sense now that I know I'm trans, but little 7-year-old me sitting with that, like that little snake skin going, wow, and just contemplating this mystery of shedding and transformation, right? There was something in me already vibrating in that trans imaginality.
Yeah.
And it's just beautiful. There's so many, I don't know if that happens with you or your clients where, I know for me, there are so many moments where I look back and I'm like, oh, now that I look at this for a trans lens, it has a different meaning.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
we did a breathwork for trans liberation a few months ago where we realized that multiple people, myself included, used to identify as a cat when we were
Mhm.
children and like thought that
Yes.
we would actually turn into a cat. And I was like, this is so like I always thought this was my funny story, and now this is like half the room has the same funny story.
Yeah. I mean, I'm so many of us are like really into like shape shifting, or, I was really into anime and all the transformation stuff, right? Or like, and it
Yeah,
makes sense because we feel that in our DNA, that transimaginality, right? That we know we are shapeshifters, right? And
yeah,
I don't know, I think of us trans, non-binary, gender expansive folks as shapeshifters, um, because and the gift that shapeshifting brings to our
yeah,
communities, right?
yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for offering that. Hmm. Well, I all good things must have a punctuation point. I'm not going to call it an end, but I always ask all my guests, is there anything else that we have not touched on that you were hoping to talk about
Mm.
today?
Oh boy. This has been such a rich conversation, and I think we've covered all the ground that I intended to. But I also agree we could talk for like hours upon hours. So definitely, I'll be happy to come back in the future. And this has just been lovely.
Thank you. And likewise, I feel so nourished. It's like towards the end of my day here. And I was like a little tired when we started this conversation. But this is such a great example of like how connecting and community
Yeah,
can bring restoration and energy, at least in my life.
yeah, yeah,
Even as an introvert, but I still feel like, oh, I feel like this refilled my cup. So
yeah,
thank you
me
so much,
too.
Eli. Well,
Thank you.
thank you for the beautiful work you do, for this wonderful conversation, for helping me refill my cup today. And to you, wonderful Gender Stories listeners and watchers. Now, if you're watching on YouTube, thank you so much for just tuning in, like episode after episode. I cannot believe that there are over 70 episodes out there. When I started this in 2018, I could never imagine they would just keep going. But thank you so much. And if this has resonated with you in any way, you can find out Eli's work from like their website, Gender Doula on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, I think as well. And all the links will be also in the episode description. But for today, please take care of yourselves and make sure that you make maybe a little bit of space for breath and connection in your life. Until next time.